The silence was the first thing. It was a structural absence, a load-bearing wall removed from the center of his life, leaving everything to creak and settle under a new, unstable pressure. Ethan Marshall stood in the doorway of the home he had built, not just with his own 2 hands on weekends, but with every overtime hour spent on noisy, dust-choked construction sites. The air, usually thick with the scent of Clara's gardenia perfume, and the low hum of the television, was thin and sterile. It smelled only of lemon-scented cleaner and finality. He had come home from the worst day of his professional life, the foreman's words still echoing in his ears. "Project's cancelled, funding pulled, we're letting the whole crew go," ready to collapse into the familiar comfort of his wife's arms. Instead, he found this profound and terrifying quiet. If stories about resilience, the price of loyalty, and the kind of love that survives the wreckage speak to you, stay with me. He walked further into the house, his work boots leaving faint, dusty footprints on the aggressively clean hardwood floors. His gaze swept the living room. The throw pillows she had spent a week agonizing over were gone. The silver-framed photos of them on the mantelpiece, smiling in front of Niagara Falls, laughing on a beach in Mexico, had vanished, leaving ghostly rectangles on the painted wood. A cold dread, heavy and metallic like rebar, began to form in his stomach. He called her name, the sound swallowed by the unnatural stillness. "Clara?" Nothing. He moved toward the kitchen, his heart hammering against his ribs like a poorly secured stud in a hurricane. And there it was. On the gleaming granite of the island countertop, a place where they had shared countless breakfasts and late-night talks, sat a single, crisp, white envelope. Next to it, placed with the kind of cruel precision a jeweler might use to display a flawless but deadly gem, was her wedding ring. The simple gold band he had slipped onto her finger 5 years ago, his own hand scrubbed raw, but still smelling faintly of sawdust and promise. He reached for the ring first, its cold weight a shock against his calloused palm. It felt like a relic from another man's life. His hands, usually so steady whether holding a nail gun or a delicate schematic, trembled as he picked up the envelope. His name was written on the front in her elegant, looping script. He tore it open, his thumb catching on the paper and ripping a jagged edge. The note inside was brutally short, the words like shards of glass. "Ethan, I can't do this anymore. I need more than this life, more than you can give me. Julian can give me the life I deserve. I've gone to be with him. The lawyer will be in touch about the divorce. I'm sorry. Clara." Julian, the name hit him like a physical blow. Julian Vance, the slick property developer whose sites Ethan's crew had sometimes worked on. A man who wore tailored suits that cost more than Ethan's monthly mortgage payment and drove a car that hummed with quiet, expensive power. Ethan had seen the way Julian looked at Clara during the company Christmas party, the way she had laughed, a little too brightly, at his jokes. He had dismissed it. He had trusted her. He had trusted the foundation they had built. Now he saw it for what it was, a facade built on his own naivety. The word sorry was the deepest insult, a throwaway nail driven into the coffin of their marriage. He sank onto a bar stool, the note crinkling in his fist. The two catastrophic events of his day began to merge into a single, overwhelming wave of failure, laid off and left, unemployed and unwanted. The structure of his world, so carefully framed and assembled over the last decade, had been condemned and demolished in the space of 8 hours. He stared at the empty space on the mantelpiece, the silence of the house pressing in on him, and felt a profound, hollowing numbness. There was no anger yet, no searing rage. There was only the cold, quiet shock of total structural collapse. The secondary burden arrived the next morning, delivered by the indifferent hand of the mail carrier. Amidst the junk mail and a sympathy card from his sister, there was a thick, windowed envelope from the bank. He tore it open with a sense of detached dread, as if watching a movie about someone else's misfortune. The words swam before his eyes, formal and unforgiving. Foreclosure. Warning. Payment overdue. The numbers were stark. They were 2 months behind on the mortgage. He stared at the statement, confused. He had always given Clara the money, trusting her to handle the bills. It was their system. He earned it. She managed it. The realization dawned on him with a sickening lurch. The more she needed, the life Julian could provide. It wasn't just about fancy restaurants and European cars. It was about solvency. She had been hiding their financial ruin from him, plastering over the cracks in their foundation while secretly planning her escape route. The numbness began to recede, replaced by a slow, burning tide of anger. It wasn't the hot, explosive rage of a sudden impact, but the deep, grinding fury of betrayal. She hadn't just left him, she had sabotaged him. She had left him in a house that was no longer his, with debts she had accrued in secret, on the day he lost the very income he needed to fix it. It was a calculated demolition. He crumpled the foreclosure notice in his hand, the paper a fragile skin over his hardening knuckles. He looked around the silent, empty house, at the clean surfaces and missing memories, and for the first time he did not see the home he had loved. He saw a meticulously staged crime scene, and he was the only victim left behind. The weeks that followed blurred into a grey, monotonous grind. Ethan operated on a kind of grim autopilot, his body moving through the motions of survival while his mind remained trapped in the wreckage of his former life. He woke up not to the smell of brewing coffee, but to the oppressive silence of the empty house. The bed felt vast and cold without Clara's warmth, the indentation on her side of the mattress a constant, physical reminder of her absence. He would lie there for long moments, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle and groan, imagining it was the sound of his own life slowly collapsing under the weight of his failure. His days were a series of rejections. He spent hours online, scrolling through job sites, the blue light of the monitor illuminating his unshaven, haggard face. He sent out dozens of applications for foreman positions, project manager roles, anything that matched his decade of experience. The replies, when they came at all, were polite, sterile form letters. Thank you for your interest, but we have decided to move forward with other candidates. The construction industry had hit a downturn, the very same one that had cost him his job, and the market was flooded with experienced men just like him. Each rejection was another small tremor, further destabilizing the ground beneath his feet. The house, once his sanctuary, became a hostile environment. Every object was a memory, every empty room an accusation. The garden she had so lovingly tended began to wither, the vibrant greens and bold reds fading to a uniform, defeated brown. Inside, dust gathered on the surfaces she had kept so immaculately clean. A thin film of grime coated the kitchen counters, dishes piled up in the sink, the remnants of solitary, tasteless meals. He would eat standing up, staring out the window at the dying garden, the food turning to ash in his mouth. The smell of the house changed. The clean lemon and gardenia scent was replaced by the stale odors of neglect, unwashed laundry, old coffee, and the faint, ever-present scent of his own despair. He started taking small, demeaning side jobs to scrape together enough cash for groceries, a leaky faucet for an elderly woman down the street, assembling a flat-pack wardrobe for a young couple who looked at his calloused hands with a mixture of pity and suspicion. Patching a section of drywall in a neighbour's garage. These tasks, once the simple, satisfying work of his trade, now felt like a punishment. He, a man who had overseen the steel framework of multi-story buildings, was now on his hands and knees, wrestling with cheap particle board and faulty plumbing for a handful of cash. The humiliation was a constant low-grade fever. The anxiety was a physical presence, a knot of cold dread that lived permanently in his gut. At night, sleep offered little escape. He would jolt awake in the dark, his heart pounding, the numbers from the foreclosure notice burning behind his eyelids. He'd walk the silent, moonlit rooms of the house, a ghost in his own life, touching the walls, running his hand over the doorframes he had installed himself. He felt a desperate, suffocating need to hold it all together, to patch the gaping holes, but he had no tools, no materials, no plan. He was a builder with nothing left to build with. The breaking point came on a Tuesday, 3 months after Clara had left. It wasn't a grand, dramatic collapse, but a small, pathetic failure that finally shattered his stoic facade. He had secured a day's labor on a small residential site, hauling bags of concrete mix for a contractor who paid cash under the table. The work was brutal, mindless, a throwback to his earliest days in the trade. The sun beat down, the air was thick with dust, and his muscles, softened by weeks of inactivity, screamed in protest. He was working alongside kids half his age who moved with an easy, tireless energy he no longer possessed. He was carrying 2 50-pound bags, one on each shoulder, his boots sinking into the muddy earth. His mind was a million miles away, replaying the final words of Clara's note, calculating the ever-growing mountain of debt. He missed a step. His ankle twisted on a loose rock, and he stumbled. The bags, too heavy to control, slipped from his grasp. One of them tore open as it hit the ground, a cloud of grey powder erupting into the air. The site supervisor, a man with a perpetually sour expression, stomped over. "Marshall, what the hell? That's a whole bag wasted. You paying for that out of your day rate?" The other workers paused, their faces a mixture of scorn and pity. And in that moment, something inside Ethan finally snapped. It wasn't the lost money, it wasn't the supervisor's anger, it was the sheer, abject humiliation of it all. The fine grey dust settled over him, coating his clothes, his hair, his skin. He looked down at the ruined bag of concrete, a symbol of his own wasted potential, his own spilled-out life. He didn't say a word. He simply dropped the other bag, turned, and walked off the site, the supervisor's angry shouts fading behind him. He walked for miles, not knowing or caring where he was going, the concrete dust mixing with the sweat on his face to form a gritty, tear-like paste. He finally arrived back at the house as dusk was falling. He walked in, the silence rushing to meet him like a physical force. He went to the kitchen and saw the single, dirty coffee cup he had left in the sink that morning. It was a small, insignificant thing, but it represented the entire mountain of his failure. The numbness was gone. The anger was gone. All that remained was a vast, empty cavern of despair. His legs gave out. He slid down the kitchen cabinets and landed on the cold linoleum floor with a heavy thud. He pulled his knees to his chest, wrapped his arms around his head, and for the first time since she had left, Ethan Marshall wept. It was not a quiet, dignified sorrow. It was a raw, guttural, soul-emptying sob, the sound of a man who had finally hit the absolute, unforgiving bottom. He lay on the cold floor for what felt like hours, the storm of grief leaving him hollowed out and strangely calm. The last of his tears dried on his dusty cheeks. The despair, which had been a churning ocean, settled into a still, dark lake. He pushed himself up slowly, his joints aching, and leaned against the cabinets. His gaze fell upon his hands resting on his knees. They were caked in dirt and cement dust, the knuckles scraped and bleeding from the fall, the calluses thick and hard. These were not the hands of a victim, they were the hands of a builder. They had framed houses, poured foundations, raised walls. They had taken raw materials, wood, steel, concrete, and given them form and purpose. They had failed, yes, but they knew how to work. A single, clear thought cut through the fog of his misery. You stop sinking or you drown. It was that simple. Clara was gone. The job was gone. The house was next. He could lie on this floor and let the water close over his head, or he could start kicking. He looked at his hands again, really looked at them. He saw the faint white scar on his left thumb from a slipped chisel when he was 19. He saw the ingrained grit under his fingernails that no amount of soap could ever fully remove. He saw a decade of hard labor, of sweat and skill and pride. She had mistaken these hands for a sign of a simple life she could discard. She had underestimated what they were capable of. He had underestimated what they were capable of. He stood up, his movements stiff but deliberate. He walked to the sink, turned on the tap, and began to scrub his hands, the cold water stinging his raw knuckles. He washed away the dirt and the concrete dust, the physical residue of his breaking point. As he dried them, he made a decision. It wasn't a grand, shouted proclamation to the heavens, but a quiet, internal vow, as solid and unyielding as the bedrock he used to search for before pouring a foundation. He would not just survive, he would build. He would start from this bedrock of absolute ruin and build something new, something stronger, something that no one could ever take from him again. The first step was an act of sacrifice. The next morning, he drove his aging but reliable pickup truck to a pawn shop in a part of town he usually avoided. The bell above the door chimed a sad, tinny welcome. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of dust and desperation. He walked to the counter, bypassing the shelves of old televisions and power tools, and reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small velvet box. Inside, nestled on a faded satin pillow, was a gold pocket watch. It had been his father's and his grandfather's before that. It was the only thing of real value he had left from his family, a tangible link to the men who had taught him the value of an honest day's work. He placed it on the counter. The pawnbroker, a man with weary eyes and a practiced air of indifference, picked it up, his loop already in his eye. He examined the engraving, the delicate mechanism, the weight of the gold. "It's a nice piece," he grunted, his voice devoid of sentiment. 300? Ethan's heart sank. It was worth 10 times that. "It's all I can do," the man said, sensing his hesitation. "Times are tough." Ethan thought of the foreclosure notice. He thought of the empty refrigerator. He needed seed money, a toehold no matter how small. "Fine," he said, his voice a dry rasp. He signed the slip, his father's name a ghost under his own, and walked out with $300 in crumpled bills. The sacrifice hurt, a sharp, clean pain, but it was also liberating. It was the cost of demolition. Now he could start clearing the site. With that money, he paid for a single, crucial thing, the renewal of his general contractor's license and insurance. It was a gamble, spending nearly all of it on paperwork, but it was a strategic one. It elevated him from a day laborer begging for scraps to a professional who could bid on his own small jobs. He spent the next week living on instant noodles and coffee, hunched over his kitchen table, which had become his new office. He scoured local listings, community boards, and hardware store bulletin boards for work. He took anything. A new deck for a suburban family, a bathroom remodel that was far more complicated than the owners let on. repairing a fence damaged in a storm. The work was grueling, solitary. He was the salesman, the project manager, the laborer, and the bookkeeper. He worked from sunrise to sunset, his muscles aching with a familiar, satisfying burn. He underbid his competitors, relying on his speed and efficiency to make a tiny profit. Every dollar he earned was reinvested, better tools, a classified ad in the local paper, a magnetic sign for the side of his truck that read Marshall Construction. It was a humble beginning, a far cry from the large-scale projects he used to manage, but it was his. He was laying a new foundation, 1 square foot at a time. It was during a particularly frustrating kitchen remodel that he met Isabella Rossi. The clients had hired him to do the demolition and installation, but they had brought in their own architect to handle the design. Ethan was on site, wrestling with a stubborn, load-bearing wall that the plans indicated should have been simple to move when she walked in. She was a whirlwind of focused energy, her dark hair pulled back in a severe ponytail, a large roll of blueprints tucked under her arm. She exuded a brisk, no-nonsense competence that bordered on intimidating. "You're the contractor?" she asked, her sharp, intelligent eyes scanning the chaotic site, taking in every detail. She didn't wait for an answer. "The plumbing rough-in is a foot off from the spec on sheet A4, and this wall," she tapped the wall he was struggling with, "has a hidden HVAC chase that isn't on the original city plans. We're going to have to reroute it." Her tone was not accusatory, but matter-of-fact. She had identified the problem in 30 seconds that had been costing him half a day. Ethan, covered in plaster dust and sweat, just nodded, impressed despite himself. "I was just figuring that out," he said, his voice gruff. "The hard way." A flicker of something, not quite a smile, but a softening of her intense expression, crossed her face. "The hard way is thorough, at least," she said. "I'm Izzy Rossi." "Ethan Marshall," he replied, wiping his dusty hand on his jeans before offering it to her. Her handshake was firm, confident. "Let's fix this," she said, unrolling her blueprints on a makeshift plywood table. For the next hour they worked together, their two worlds, the theoretical world of architectural design and the practical world of construction, colliding and merging. She had the vision. He had the real-world knowledge of how materials behaved, how structures breathed. It was a dynamic he hadn't experienced before, a partnership of equals. When she left, the problems were solved and a new, more elegant plan was in place. He found himself watching her go, a strange sense of respect settling over him. He didn't know it then, but he had just met his new architect in more ways than one. The next 7 years were a testament to the power of the long game. They were not a cinematic montage of instant success, but a slow, grinding, deliberate ascent, built day by day, brick by brick. Time became a measurable quantity, marked not by holidays or birthdays, but by completed projects, paid-off debts, and the gradual hardening of his resolve. The first 2 years were the leanest, the hardest. Ethan worked relentlessly under the banner of Marshall Construction. He lived and breathed the work. His truck was his office, his evenings were for paperwork, and his sleep was a brief, dreamless recharge. He poured every ounce of profit back into the business, slowly upgrading his tools, his insurance, his reputation. The memory of Clara, of the foreclosure, of the pawned watch became a cold, hard fuel. It didn't burn with passion anymore. It was a low, steady flame that kept him moving forward in the dark. He saw Izzy Rossi on a few other small projects. Their interactions were always professional, efficient. She would point out a design flaw, he would suggest a practical solution. A quiet, unspoken respect grew between them, a shared language of competence and dedication. The turning point in his professional life came in the form of Marcus Thorne. Thorne was a legend in the local construction scene, owner of a mid-sized, highly respected firm, Thorne Construction. He was a gruff, old-school builder who had a reputation for being tough but fair. Ethan was bidding against Thorne for a lucrative community centre renovation. He knew he was the underdog, a one-man operation against an established company. He spent a week preparing his bid, poring over every detail, finding efficiencies Thorne's larger, more cumbersome operation might miss. He submitted a bid that was leaner, smarter, and more aggressive than anyone expected. He didn't get the job, but he did get a phone call. "Ethan Marshall?" a gravelly voice grunted. "Marcus Thorne, your bid on the community centre was a pain in my arse. You cost me 10 grand just to match your numbers." Ethan's heart sank. "Sorry to hear that, Mr. Thorne," he said, expecting a tirade. Instead, there was a pause. "Don't be sorry. Be in my office tomorrow, 9 o'clock. He hung up. The next day, Ethan walked into Thorne's office, a modest, cluttered space that smelled of old blueprints and cigar smoke. Thorne was a mountain of a man with hands like catcher's mitts and eyes that missed nothing. He got straight to the point. "I can't beat you, so I'm buying you," he said. "I'm getting too old for this. I need a project manager who thinks like an owner, someone hungry. I'll absorb your business, clear your startup debts, and give you a salary that's triple what you're making now, but you'll work for it. What do you say?" It was the opportunity of a lifetime. But Ethan hesitated. He had fought so hard for his independence. "I need a path to partnership," Ethan said, the words coming out before he could second-guess them. Thorne stared at him for a long moment, then a slow, grudging smile spread across his face. "I knew I liked you," he grunted. 5 years. You prove yourself in 5 years and we talk partnership. Deal?" "Deal," Ethan said. They shook on it. His calloused hand swallowed in Thorne's massive grip. Working for Thorne Construction was like being drafted into the major leagues. The scale of the projects was immense, the logistics complex. Ethan thrived. His years of solitary struggle had honed his skills, making him ruthlessly efficient and endlessly resourceful. He earned the respect of the crews with his practical knowledge and his unwillingness to ask any man to do a job he wouldn't do himself. He clashed initially with the firm's chief architect, Izzy Rossi. Thorne had hired her full-time a year earlier, impressed by her innovative designs and meticulous attention to detail. Their professional dynamic intensified. They were two sides of the same coin, often arguing over schematics and material choices. He was the grounding force of practicality. She was the soaring vision of aesthetics and form. Their arguments in the planning office were legendary, but they always resulted in a better building. Slowly, outside the context of work, the armor began to crack. It started with late nights at the office, going over blueprints for a difficult project. They would order cheap Chinese food and talk, first about work, then about other things. He learned she was the daughter of an Italian stonemason, that she had a love for brutalist architecture, and that she had a quiet, dry wit that only emerged when her guard was down. She, in turn, began to see past his stoic, work-obsessed exterior. She saw the fierce intelligence in his eyes, the unwavering loyalty he showed his crews, the deep, unhealed wound that drove him. She never asked about his past, but she seemed to understand it. And one night, after a grueling 17-hour day, fixing a massive error made by a subcontractor, they were the last two people in the office. He was exhausted, rubbing his temples. "You carry too much," she said softly, her voice losing its professional edge. He looked up, surprised. "It's the only way I know how to build," he admitted. She simply nodded, a universe of understanding in that small gesture. His personal transformation was as gradual and profound as his professional one. The relentless grind of his early struggle had chiseled away his youthful naivety, leaving behind a man who was harder, more disciplined, and more self-assured. The frantic energy of survival was replaced by the calm, deliberate focus of a master strategist. His physical appearance changed. He traded his worn work shirts for crisp, tailored button-downs. His hands, though still strong, lost the perpetual grit. They now held pens, contracts, and blueprints, more often than power tools. The lines around his eyes deepened, and flecks of grey began to appear at his temples, lending him an air of authority that had nothing to do with a job title. The 5 years of his agreement with Thorne passed. Ethan had not just proven himself, he had become indispensable. He had streamlined operations, brought in major contracts, and with Izzy's designs helped Thorne Construction win a slew of architectural awards. On the 5th anniversary of his hiring, Thorne called him into the office. He pushed a set of documents across the desk. "Thorne Marshall Construction," the letterhead read. "I'm not giving you a piece of my company, Ethan," Thorne said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've built your own damn half of it. Welcome, partner." That same evening, Ethan found Izzy on the unfinished rooftop of their latest project, a sleek, modern high-rise that would reshape the city's skyline. The wind whipped her hair as she stared out at the sprawling grid of lights below. "It's official," he said, standing beside her. "Thorne Marshall." She turned to him, a genuine, unguarded smile on her face. "I never had a doubt, Ethan," she said. The space between them, once filled with professional tension and unspoken histories, now hummed with a different kind of energy. For years, their relationship had been a slow-burn romance, built on a foundation of mutual respect and shared struggle, a structure assembled piece by piece with late-night conversations, shared victories, and quiet support. "Izzy," he began, his voice rough. "For 7 years I've been building a company, but I've been building walls around myself too. You're the only person who ever saw a door." She looked up at him, her dark eyes shining in the reflected city light. "I wasn't looking for a door," she said softly. "I was just admiring the architecture." He reached out and gently touched her face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. It was a gesture more intimate than any he had made in years. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing for a brief moment. In the silence of that rooftop, surrounded by the steel and glass skeleton of their shared ambition, the unspoken became spoken. He leaned in and kissed her, and it was not a kiss of frantic passion but of quiet, profound homecoming. It tasted of concrete dust, of late-night coffee, of shared blueprints, and of a future that was finally, solidly their own. The billboard went up on a crisp autumn morning in the 8th year after Clara had left. It was enormous, dominating the skyline above the busiest freeway in the city. It wasn't an advertisement in the traditional sense, it was a statement. Against a stark, elegant background, it featured 3 portraits, a grizzled, smiling Marcus Thorne, a sharp, confident Isabella Rossi, and in the center, a man with graying temples, a calm, steady gaze, and a face that spoke of hard-won success. Ethan Marshall. Below the portraits, the text was simple and powerful. Thorne Marshall Construction. We are reshaping the horizon. Ethan saw it for the first time on his way to a site meeting. He was in his car, stopped in traffic, when his eyes were drawn upward. Seeing his own face, 20 feet high, looking out over the city he had helped to build, was a surreal experience. He felt a jolt, not of ego, but of a quiet, profound sense of arrival. It was the physical manifestation of the long game. The man on that billboard was a different man from the one who had wept on his kitchen floor. That man had been rubble. This man was a skyscraper. He thought briefly of Clara, not with anger or bitterness, but with a distant, detached pity. He wondered what she would think if she saw it. He dismissed the thought almost immediately. It didn't matter. He had a meeting to get to. Clara Vance, she had dropped the Marshall name as quickly as she had dropped him, saw the billboard 2 days later. She was in a taxi, stuck in the same traffic, on her way to a temp agency. The last 7 years had not been kind to her. The life Julian Vance had promised her had been a glittering illusion, a penthouse built on a foundation of fraud and bad debt. For a while, it had been everything she dreamed of. The European vacations, the designer clothes, the effortless flow of money. But Julian's empire had crumbled even faster than it had been built. He was embroiled in lawsuits, his assets frozen, his charm curdling into a bitter, desperate cruelty. He had left her, just as she had left Ethan, with a short, unapologetic note and a mountain of debt that was legally attached to her name. She had been adrift ever since, bouncing between friends' spare rooms and short-term rentals, her expensive clothes looking increasingly worn, her skills, once dedicated to managing a lavish social life, proving worthless in the real world. She was broke, approaching 40, and stripped of the one thing she valued above all else: status. And then she saw the billboard. She saw Ethan's face. It was him, but it wasn't. The boyish softness was gone, replaced by a formidable confidence. He looked powerful. He looked wealthy. He looked like everything she had left him for, and everything she had lost. A toxic cocktail of emotions churned in her stomach: rage, envy, and a desperate, calculated flicker of hope. He had loved her once, deeply. Perhaps, she thought, that love, like a pilot light, had never truly been extinguished. She found the address for Thorne Marshall Construction online. It was in the very building featured in their portfolio, the sleek, high-rise Ethan and Izzy had stood atop. The lobby was a cathedral of glass and steel, cool and intimidating. When she gave her name to the receptionist, she made sure to use her married one. Clara Marshall, to see Ethan Marshall. She enjoyed the flicker of confusion on the young woman's face. After a brief whispered phone call, the receptionist directed her to the top floor. The elevator ride was silent and swift, a smooth ascent into the heart of his new empire. When the doors opened, she stepped into a stunning, minimalist office space with panoramic views of the city. A woman with dark hair pulled back in a chic bun and wearing a beautifully tailored architectural dress approached her. It was the woman from the billboard. "Can I help you?" Izzy Rossi asked, her voice polite, but with an undercurrent of steel. "I'm here to see Ethan," Clara said, forcing a warm, familiar smile. "I'm Clara." Izzy's expression didn't change, but her eyes, sharp and intelligent, did a quick, comprehensive scan, taking in Clara's slightly too old designer dress and the faint air of desperation clinging to her like cheap perfume. "He's in a meeting," Izzy said calmly. "He'll be out shortly. You can wait here." She gestured to a leather sofa that probably cost more than Clara's last 3 months' rent. As Izzy turned to walk away, the door to the main conference room opened, and Ethan stepped out, followed by Marcus Thorne. He stopped when he saw her. For a fraction of a second, a flicker of the old Ethan, the shocked, wounded man, crossed his face. Then it was gone, replaced by a calm, impenetrable mask of polite neutrality. He looked from Clara to Izzy, a silent question passing between them. "Clara," he said, his voice even, betraying nothing. "This is a surprise." "Ethan," she breathed, her voice thick with manufactured emotion. She had rehearsed this. She moved toward him, her hands outstretched, intending to create a scene of tearful reunion. She was going to be the prodigal wife, returned from the wilderness, remorseful and broken. "I saw the billboard. I had to see you. I've made such a terrible mistake." She reached for him, but he didn't move. He stood there, solid and unyielding as one of his own concrete pillars, and she was forced to stop, her hands hovering awkwardly in the space between them. The performance faltered. Her plea for pity hung in the air, unanswered, in the beautiful, silent, and terribly expensive office he now commanded. The silence in the office was thick and heavy, broken only by the distant hum of the city below. Clara let her hands drop to her sides, the first act of her drama having failed to land. Ethan's face remained a polite, unreadable mask. He was not angry, he was not gloating, he was simply observing. It was this unnerving calm that truly threw her. She had expected rage, or perhaps a bitter, triumphant satisfaction. Either of those she could have worked with, manipulated. This serene neutrality gave her nothing to hold on to. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice losing its breathy, emotional quality and becoming more direct. "Somewhere private?" Ethan glanced at Izzy, who gave a nearly imperceptible nod before turning and walking back toward her own office, the picture of professional discretion. "My office," Ethan said, gesturing toward a door at the far end of the open planned space. His office was like the man he had become, clean, functional, and powerful. One wall was a floor-to-ceiling window offering a godlike view of the city. Another was covered in schematics and project timelines. A large, dark wood desk stood in the center, free of clutter except for a laptop and a single, framed photograph. Clara's eyes darted to the photo. It was of Ethan, Izzy, and Marcus Thorne, all three of them laughing, covered in dust, on a construction site. The easy camaraderie in the photo was a punch to the gut. "You've done well, Ethan," she said, running a hand over the back of a leather visitor's chair. The words were meant to sound admiring, but they came out laced with an envy so sharp it was almost metallic. "I always knew you were capable of great things." It was a lie, and they both knew it. She had seen his capability as a limitation, a life sentence to a world of sawdust and modest paychecks. "What do you want, Clara?" he asked, his voice quiet but firm. He hadn't sat down. He remained standing, leaning against the edge of his desk, creating a subtle but clear barrier between them. He was in control of this space, of this conversation. This was her cue for Act Two, the victim's plea. She let her shoulders slump, summoning tears to her eyes. "I was a fool," she began, her voice trembling. "I was young and stupid and dazzled by glitter. I didn't understand what real value was. I didn't understand what I had with you." "Julian, he was a monster, Ethan. He ruined me. He took everything and left me with nothing. I've been living a nightmare." She paused, watching his face for any sign of softening, any flicker of the old protective Ethan. She saw nothing. He was a stone wall. "I'm sorry to hear that," he said, the words polite but empty of any real sympathy. They were the kind of words one offers to a stranger who has had a misfortune. Her frustration began to curdle into anger. The pity play wasn't working. It was time to escalate. It was time to remind him of the leverage she believed she held. She straightened up, her tearful demeanor vanishing as if shed like a coat. "I need help, Ethan," she said, her tone hardening. "A man in your position, a small settlement would be nothing to you, a gesture of goodwill, for old times' sake." "No," he said simply. The single word was not harsh or angry. It was a fact, a closed door. And that's when she played her trump card. A cruel, triumphant smirk touched her lips. "I don't think you understand," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You see, I was talking to a lawyer friend of mine, just casually, and an interesting fact came up. Those divorce papers your lawyer sent all those years ago, I never signed the final one. I was distracted. It was a messy time, which means, Ethan, she leaned forward, savoring the moment, in the eyes of the law, you and I are still married. She let the words hang in the air, confident in their explosive power. She watched him, expecting shock, panic, anger. She was ready for the negotiation to begin. And in this state, she continued, pressing her advantage, that means that everything you've built, this company, this building, all of it is marital property, my marital property, half of it, to be precise. She gestured expansively at the window, at the city he had reshaped. So you can give me a small, quiet settlement now, or you can give my lawyer a very, very large one later. Your choice. This was the moment of her victory, the checkmate she had been planning since she saw the billboard. But Ethan didn't panic. He didn't shout. He didn't even flinch. Instead, a look of something she couldn't quite decipher crossed his face. It wasn't fear. It was something closer to disappointment, as if he had expected better from her. He pushed himself off the desk and walked calmly to a sleek filing cabinet. He opened a drawer, his movements unhurried, and pulled out a single, thick folder. He held it in his hand, tapping it lightly against his palm. "You're right about one thing, Clara," he said, his voice still unnervingly calm. "We are still married." He walked back and placed the folder on the desk in front of her. "You should have signed the papers." He looked her directly in the eye, and for the first time she saw a flicker of emotion. It wasn't anger. It was a cold, hard, resolute fire, like the heart of a furnace. "You think you've laid a trap for me," he said, his voice dropping low, each word precise and weighted. "You think I'm the same man you left in that house, the man who didn't read the fine print. But I've learned to read the fine print. I've learned to check the foundations before I build. Let's talk about the law, shall we?" The showdown was not what Clara had envisioned. There was no shouting, no dramatic pleading. It was a quiet, clinical demolition, and she was the structure being brought down. The setting was perfect in its brutal irony. Ethan's magnificent office, a testament to the success she had come to claim, became the courtroom where her hopes would be executed. "You're a builder, Ethan. You deal in concrete and steel. I deal in people. Law is a bit more complicated," she said, trying to regain her footing, to project an air of sophisticated knowledge she didn't possess. The smirk was still on her face, but it felt brittle, painted on. "You're wrong," he replied, his voice a low, steady rumble. "Law is exactly like building. It's a structure. It has rules. It has load-bearing principles. And it has fine print. You just never bothered to read the blueprints." He tapped the folder on his desk. "Let's call this the as-built drawing of our marriage." He didn't call a lawyer. He didn't need to. He had been preparing for this possibility for 7 years, not out of a desire for revenge, but out of a builder's instinct to account for every contingency, every potential point of failure. He had become a man who left nothing to chance. "You're right," he began, opening the folder and laying the first document on the polished wood of the desk. "You never signed the final petition for dissolution. My lawyer informed me of that 6 years, and 11 months ago. You probably thought that was your ace in the hole, a piece of leverage you could use someday if things went south." He looked at her, and his gaze was not one of a wronged husband, but of a master strategist assessing a flawed opponent. It was the most predictable move you could have made. He slid another paper across the desk. It was a copy of a legal filing. "This is a petition for divorce that my lawyer filed on my behalf the day after you left. It cites abandonment and adultery as the grounds. We have sworn affidavits from 2 of our former neighbours who saw you leaving with Julian Vance. We have a copy of the lease for the apartment he rented for you, signed 3 weeks before you even wrote your little note." Clara's face went pale. The smirk vanished, replaced by a slack-jawed disbelief. You filed?" "Of course I did," Ethan said, his tone matter-of-fact. "You think I would just let a demolition site sit there unsecured? Number 1 contained it." He continued, his voice calm and methodical, as if he were walking a new client through a project plan. "Now here's the interesting part of the law you seem to have missed. In this state, the legal date of separation is a critical marker. It's the day the court recognizes the marriage as being irreconcilably broken. From that day forward, any assets or debts accrued by either party are considered their own separate property, not communal marital property." He let that sink in. He could see the frantic calculations happening behind her eyes, the dawning horror. "Our legal date of separation," he continued, tapping the document, "is the date you moved in with Julian Vance, a date we have established with sworn testimony and financial records. Thorne Marshall Construction was founded 5 years after that date. This building, my partnership, my current assets, they were all built on a foundation that was laid long after our marriage was legally and financially dead." He wasn't finished. The final crushing blow was yet to come. "So, when you say you're entitled to half of my marital property," he said, his voice softening with a terrifying surgical precision, "you are absolutely correct." He pulled one last document from the folder. It was a financial statement from 7 years ago. "Here is a full accounting of the marital property as it existed on our date of separation. A foreclosed house with a negative equity of $30,000, 2 maxed-out credit cards in your name totaling another $22,000, an auto loan on your car for $12,000, a personal loan you took out, which I only discovered later, for $10,000. He pushed the statement toward her. The total net worth of the Marshall marriage at the time of its dissolution was negative $64,000. You are legally entitled to half of that. So, Clara, you are right. You are owed something. You owe my half of that debt. $32,000 plus 7 years of interest. My accountant has calculated the current total." He slid one final single sheet of paper across the desk. It was an invoice. Clara stared at the invoice, her face a mask of utter devastation. The number on the bottom line seemed to vibrate with a malevolent energy. This wasn't a negotiation, it was an annihilation. She had walked in here with a weapon, only to find he had built a fortress, and her weapon was not only useless, but it was now pointed directly back at her. All the air went out of her. Her body seemed to shrink, the expensive dress now looking like a cheap costume. The entitled, manipulative woman was gone, and in her place was a desperate, broke, and thoroughly defeated person. You planned this," she whispered, her voice a hoarse croak. "No," Ethan said, and the coldness in his voice was absolute. "I didn't plan it. I prepared for it. There's a difference. You plan for things you want to happen. You prepare for things that might. It's called risk management." He closed the folder, the soft click of the cardboard echoing in the silent room. "The petition for the debt has been ready for years. I just never had a reason to file it. I was content to let it go, to let you go, but you came back. You tried to turn my life's work into a bargaining chip. You tried to threaten the foundation of the life I've built with Izzy and Marcus." He stood up to his full height, no longer leaning, no longer casual. He was the man on the billboard now, powerful and immovable. "The meeting is over, Clara. My lawyer will be in touch about the debt, or not. Frankly, I don't care. All I want is for you to walk out of this office, out of this building, and out of my life, permanently." He looked at her, the defeated woman huddled in the chair, and he felt nothing. Not pity, not triumph, not hatred. Just a profound and final sense of closure. The last rotten timber of his old life had finally been cleared from the site. Clara stumbled out of his office, not looking back. She didn't say another word. The click of the heavy office door closing behind her was a sound of absolute finality. Ethan stood there for a long moment, the silence of the room settling around him. He looked at the folder on his desk, the weapon he had held in reserve for so long. He picked it up, walked over to a heavy-duty shredder in the corner of his office, and fed the entire folder into it. The machine whirred to life, its grinding teeth destroying the affidavits, the financial statements, the invoice. He wasn't going to pursue the debt. The victory was not in ruining her. It was in protecting what he had built. The act of destroying the file was the last piece of demolition. The sight was finally, truly clear. A profound sense of lightness filled him, a feeling he hadn't realized he was missing. It was the absence of a weight he had been carrying for 8 years, the weight of a potential threat, of an unfinished story. He felt the tension in his shoulders, a tension he had lived with for so long it had become a part of him, simply dissolve. It was over, not with a bang, but with the quiet hum of a shredder. He walked to the window and looked out at the city. It looked different, brighter. He left his office and walked out into the main space. Marcus was gone, but Izzy was standing by her desk, pretending to organize a set of blueprints. She wasn't looking at him, but he knew she had been waiting. He walked over to her, and she finally looked up, her dark eyes full of unspoken questions. He didn't need to give her the details. She could read the resolution on his face. "It's over," he said softly. She searched his eyes for a moment longer, looking for any sign of lingering pain or anger. Finding none, she gave him a small, warm smile that reached all the way to her eyes. "Good," she said simply. Her hand found his, her fingers lacing through his. Her touch was warm, solid, real. It was an anchor in the present, pulling him away from the ghosts of the past. "Thorne is taking us all out for dinner to celebrate the new zoning approval," she said, her voice bringing him back to the here and now. "But I told him we might be late." "Let's skip it," he said. "I have a better idea." He led her toward the private elevator that went up to the building's residential floors. They rode in comfortable silence, his hand holding hers. The elevator opened directly into the penthouse apartment they had designed together, their home. It was still partially unfinished, with plastic sheeting over some of the furniture and the smell of fresh paint in the air, but it was theirs. He led her through the sprawling living space to the massive glass doors that opened onto a wide terrace. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. The entire city was spread out before them, a glittering tapestry of light and life. They were standing on top of their empire. But as Ethan looked out, he wasn't looking at the buildings as trophies. He wasn't tallying up his net worth or reveling in his power. He was looking at the woman standing beside him, her face bathed in the warm light of the setting sun. For years, he had been driven by the need to prove something, to build a fortress so high and so strong that no one could ever hurt him again. He had succeeded. But standing here, with Izzy's hand in his, he realized the fortress was not the point. The steel, the glass, the money, the company, they weren't the empire. They were just the scaffolding. The real structure, the one that mattered, was the life he had built with her. The trust, the respect, the shared struggle, the quiet love. That was the foundation that would last. That was the thing of true value. I spent so long building walls, he said, his voice quiet, almost carried away by the wind, to keep the past out. She turned to him, her expression soft. And look what you built instead, she said, gesturing not to the city, but to the home around them, to the space between them. You built a future. He looked at her, at this incredible, brilliant, loyal woman who had seen the blueprint of the man he could be when all he saw was wreckage. She had been his partner in every sense of the word, helping him draw the plans, lay the foundation, and raise the walls of this new life. The last ghost had been exorcised, the last debt had been settled. The long, grinding war was finally, truly over. He was free. He pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her, and breathed in the scent of her hair. It smelled of home. They stood there for a long time, watching the city lights blink on as darkness fell, two partners on the pinnacle of their world, looking toward the horizon. The past was a demolished building, a cleared site. The future was an open blueprint, waiting for them to draw it together. He felt a profound sense of peace, a quiet, solid joy that was more powerful than any triumphant victory. He had lost a life built on sand, and from the bedrock of his deepest failure, he had built an empire of stone with the right architect by his side. He kissed the top of her head. "Let's go home."